I never thought a simple hiking trip could turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. The plan was straightforward: a solo trek along a well-known trail in the Pacific Northwest. I had done my research, packed the essentials, and even left my itinerary with a friend. Nothing about this trip felt risky or out of the ordinary until it was. The morning started off perfectly. The air was crisp, and the sun filtered through the towering pines as I parked my car at the trailhead. I slung my pack over my shoulders, double-checked my map, and started walking. The trail wound through dense forests and occasionally opened up to breathtaking views of the mountains. Everything about it felt serene, almost therapeutic. After about 3 hours of hiking, I reached a fork in the trail. One path continued along the main route, while the other led to a smaller, less traveled section that promised a panoramic view at the summit. I stood there for a moment, debating. The smaller trail wasn't on my original plan, but the thought of a quiet, isolated spot to take in the scenery was too tempting. I turned onto the smaller trail, feeling a twinge of excitement at the prospect of venturing somewhere a bit off the beaten path. The trail narrowed quickly, and the trees grew closer together. The sunlight struggled to break through the canopy, casting the path in a muted green glow. I kept my pace steady, occasionally checking my GPS to ensure I was heading in the right direction. The incline grew steeper, and I had to stop a few times to catch my breath. Despite the effort, I was enjoying the solitude. About an hour into the detour, I noticed something strange. The trail, which had been well defined up to this point, started to fade. The ground was covered in thick moss and fallen leaves, making it hard to discern the path. I pulled out my map and GPS again, but the signal was weak, and the map didn't show this specific section in much detail. Still, I figured I couldn't be too far from the summit. I decided to push on, keeping an eye out for any signs or markers. As I climbed higher, the forest grew eerily quiet. The chirping birds and rustling leaves that had accompanied me earlier were now absent. The only sound was my boots crunching against the ground. It felt like the air itself was heavier, pressing against my chest with every step. I told myself it was just the altitude and fatigue playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the growing unease. Then I saw it. A crude wooden sign nailed to a tree, its paint faded and almost illegible. The letters spelled out Summit with an arrow pointing straight ahead. Relieved, I followed the direction, hoping the view would make the struggle worth it. But the trail didn't lead to a summit. Instead, it opened into a small clearing. The clearing was strange. The grass was flattened in spots, almost as if something had been repeatedly pressed against it. In the center stood a dilapidated wooden structure, barely more than a frame. It looked like it had once been a cabin, but now it was just rotting beams and a collapsed roof. I hesitated, debating whether to investigate. My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, carefully navigating the uneven ground. The air inside the structure was damp and carried a faint, metallic smell. As I moved, the floor creaked ominously under my weight. Among the debris, I noticed what looked like an old tin box partially buried under a pile of leaves. Picked it up and opened it. Inside were yellowed papers, photographs, and a small, rusted knife. The photos were black and white, depicting a family, a man, woman, and 2 children, standing in front of the cabin. Their faces were blurred and hard to make out, but something about the images unsettled me. The people looked stiff, almost unnatural, as if they had been posed against their will. A sudden noise made me freeze. It sounded like a branch snapping, sharp and close. My heart raced as I scanned the forest around me, but I couldn't see anything beyond the dense trees. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that it was probably just an animal. Still, the sense of being watched was undeniable. Deciding it was time to leave, I carefully placed the box back where I found it and retraced my steps to the trail. But as I walked, something felt off. The trail didn't look the same. The trees seemed thicker, and the ground was covered in more debris than before. I checked my GPS again, but the signal was completely gone now. Panic began to creep in as I realized I might be lost. I tried to backtrack, but every turn looked identical. The towering trees and uneven terrain disoriented me. I stopped to gather my thoughts and drink some water, hoping to regain my composure. That's when I noticed the footprint. It was fresh, embedded in the soft ground, and clearly not mine. The size and shape suggested a boot, similar to what a hiker might wear. Relief washed over me at the thought of another person nearby. I called out, "Hello!" My voice echoed briefly before fading into silence. No response. I waited, listening, but heard nothing. The footprint led away from the trail, deeper into the forest. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it, thinking it might lead to someone who could help me find my way back. The tracks were sporadic, appearing and disappearing on the uneven ground. I followed them for what felt like hours, my nerves fraying with each step. The forest grew darker as the day wore on, and I could feel the temperature dropping. Just as I was about to give up, I saw something in the distance, a flicker of light. I hurried toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks. The light grew brighter, revealing a small campsite. A fire burned low in a ring of stones, and a tattered tent stood nearby. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The campsite looked abandoned. The fire was too well maintained to have been left for long, but there was no sign of its owner. I called out again, but only the crackling fire answered. Hesitant, I approached the tent. The zipper was partially open, and inside I could see a sleeping bag and a few scattered belongings. A flashlight, a canteen, and a notebook. Against my better judgment, I picked up the notebook and flipped through its pages. Most of it was illegible, the writing smudged or faded, but a few lines stood out. "Something is wrong here. I keep hearing noises at night. The trail disappears." My hands trembled as I read. The last entry was a single word, scrawled hastily across the page: "Run." A sudden rustling behind me made me whirl around. The forest was still, but I could feel eyes on me, the sensation so intense it made my skin crawl. I backed away from the tent, my breath coming in short gasps. The rational part of my mind screamed to grab the flashlight and leave, but my legs felt like lead. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the darkness. They were heavy, crunching the forest floor with a rhythm that matched my pounding heart. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were taking their time, closing the distance between us. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. Dropping the notebook, I turned and ran, plunging blindly into the forest. Branches whipped against my face and arms, but I didn't stop. The footsteps followed, relentless and unchanging. I couldn't tell how far behind they were, but the sound never wavered, always the same distance away. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed for rest, but I pushed on until I saw a break in the trees ahead. Bursting through, I found myself on a dirt road. Relief and confusion hit me in equal measure. I had no idea where the road led, but it was better than staying in the forest. I followed it, forcing myself to keep moving despite my exhaustion. After what felt like an eternity, I saw headlights in the distance. A truck rumbled toward me, its engine a sound I never thought I'd be so grateful to hear. I waved my arms frantically, and the vehicle slowed to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with a concerned expression, rolled down his window. "You okay?" he asked. I could barely get the words out. "Lost? Trail. Someone's out there." He didn't ask questions. He opened the door and helped me into the passenger seat. As we drove away, I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. But the road remained empty, the forest swallowing whatever had been following me. The driver took me to the nearest ranger station, where I reported what had happened. A search team was sent out to investigate, but they found no trace of the campsite, the cabin, or anyone else on the trail. The official explanation was that I had gotten lost and disoriented, letting my imagination get the better of me. But I know what I heard, what I felt. I haven't been hiking since. The forest, once a place of peace and wonder, now feels like a labyrinth of unseen dangers. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there with me, something that watched and waited. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear those footsteps in my dreams, slow and deliberate, chasing me all over again. The trailhead felt alive with a quiet hum, a mix of early morning wind rustling the trees and the muffled thuds of boots against packed dirt. I'd chosen this hike for its solitude, an unmarked path through a forest barely mentioned online, whispered about by locals as a true escape. No crowds, no noise, just me and the wilderness. My pack was light but efficient: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a lightweight jacket. A pocket knife rested in the side pouch. The essentials, I thought. The first mile was uneventful. The trail a wide corridor through towering pines. Sunlight filtered in patches, dappling the ground with golden specks. The air was cool, crisp. It felt good to be out, away from emails, calls, and the endless churn of daily obligations. My breathing found a rhythm, matching the cadence of my steps. It was just me and nature, exactly as I'd hoped. By the second mile, the trail began to narrow. Roots jutted out, and rocks became more frequent, demanding attention. The pines thinned slightly, replaced by clusters of birch and the occasional maple. I noticed a faint stream paralleling the trail, its gurgling a pleasant accompaniment. I paused to take a sip from my water bottle, scanning the forest. It was so quiet, so still, the kind of silence that makes you feel like an intruder. Around the third mile, the trail turned steep. My calves burned as I ascended, the dirt path winding tightly against the slope. The trees closed in, their branches interlocking above like a natural cathedral. The sunlight dimmed, and the air felt cooler, almost damp. I pushed on, driven by a stubborn need to see the view I'd read about. A secluded ridge overlooking an untouched valley. At one point, I stumbled on a loose rock, catching myself with a hand against a tree. My palm came away sticky with sap. I wiped it on my pants and looked down the trail. Felt different. Not wrong exactly, but unfamiliar. The path had become less defined, the edges blurred by fallen leaves and overgrowth. I glanced back but couldn't see where I'd come from. The trail wasn't marked after all. Keep moving forward, I told myself. Trails often felt less clear the deeper you went. Besides, the ridge couldn't be far now. By the fourth mile, I knew something was off. The trail had all but vanished, replaced by uneven ground littered with twigs and leaves. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. The trees were denser here, their trunks forming an almost uniform wall. I pulled out my phone, hoping to check my GPS. No service. Of course, I felt the first prick of unease then. Not panic, just a nagging discomfort. I was experienced enough to know that getting lost didn't mean you were doomed. Stay calm. Orient yourself. I'd read the advice 100 times. I took a deep breath and tried to think clearly. The sun was still visible through the canopy, though lower now. West. If I kept the sun to my right, I'd eventually hit a main road or a stream leading out. Streams often led to civilization. It was a plan, and having a plan felt good. I walked for what felt like an hour, but the forest only grew thicker. The ground sloped unpredictably, rising and falling in ways that made my legs ache. I tripped twice, once catching my shin on a sharp rock. The cut wasn't deep, but it stung. I wrapped it with a bandana from my pack and pressed on. The light was fading now, casting the forest in shades of gray. I stopped to take stock. My water was half gone, my stomach growling. The unease had grown into a steady thrum of anxiety. I pulled out my pocket knife, the weight of it in my hand oddly comforting. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shape, dark and angular, barely visible through the trees. As I moved closer, details emerged. It was a structure, a cabin maybe, though it looked more like a shed. The wood was weathered, almost black, and the roof sagged in the middle. No windows, just a single door slightly ajar. Relief surged through me. Shelter, maybe even a way to call for help. I approached cautiously, the leaves crunching underfoot loud in the stillness. The air around the cabin felt different, heavier. I couldn't explain it, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. I pushed the door open. The interior was bare. Dirt floor, a small wooden bench, and what looked like an old stove in the corner. No signs of recent use. I called out, my voice startlingly loud. No response. The cabin was small but solid. It would do for the night. I closed the door, securing it with a rusty latch. Sitting on the bench, I rummaged through my pack for a granola bar. The first bite tasted like cardboard, but I forced it down, washing it with a sip of water. My plan was simple: rest, wait for morning, and retrace my steps in daylight. Everything feels worse in the dark, I reminded myself, but the night didn't bring rest. It brought sounds, started faint like footsteps, soft, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped, replaced by the creak of wood. Something or someone was outside. I gripped my pocket knife tighter, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. Minutes passed, or was it hours? The sounds didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The walls of the cabin felt too thin, the latch on the door too weak. Sleep was impossible. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, every muscle tense. The forest looked different in the morning light, less menacing but no less unfamiliar. There were no footprints, no signs of disturbance. Maybe I'd imagined it. Exhaustion could do that. I decided to keep moving. Staying put wasn't an option. I picked a direction and walked, keeping the rising sun to my left. The forest began to thin, the ground leveling out. My spirits lifted slightly. This was progress. Then I saw them, scattered on the ground, half hidden by leaves. Bones, small ones maybe from a deer or a fox. But the arrangement was odd, almost deliberate. A circle with smaller bones placed in lines radiating outward. My stomach turned. I moved faster now, my focus narrowing to the path ahead. The unease had returned, sharper than before. Every sound felt amplified, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. The forest felt alive, but not in a comforting way. Finally, I broke through the trees into a clearing. A dirt road cut through the landscape, winding out of sight. Relief flooded me. A road meant people, and people meant help. I followed it, my pace quick despite the ache in my legs. Hours later, I stumbled into a small town. A gas station clerk let me use their phone, and I called a friend to pick me up. As I waited, sipping a lukewarm coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling of the forest. The sounds, the bones, the cabin. It stayed with me, a weight I couldn't explain. I never found out who or what was in that forest. I told myself it didn't matter. I was safe now, back in the world of streetlights and locked doors. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I hear those footsteps again, soft, deliberate, just beyond the edge of the light. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow over the dense forest that stretched endlessly ahead. It was late September, and the air carried the crisp bite of early autumn. I decided to take a solo hike on a lesser-known trail about 30 miles outside of town, a place I'd found online. The reviews described it as secluded, quiet, and perfect for getting away from the noise of the city. That's exactly what I wanted. The trailhead was unassuming, marked by a small wooden sign with the words Ravens Hollow etched into it. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, save for an old pickup truck parked in the far corner. I shrugged off the mild unease that stirred in my chest and started down the path. I'd hiked alone plenty of times before, and this was no different, or so I thought. The trail began easily enough. A narrow dirt path wound through tall pines and maples, their leaves beginning to turn shades of fiery orange and red. The forest was alive with sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, the occasional scurry of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. I felt a sense of calm settle over me as I walked deeper into the woods. This was what I'd come for: peace, solitude, and the chance to clear my mind. After about an hour, the trail started to climb. The incline wasn't steep, but it was enough to make my legs burn and my breath quicken. The forest grew denser here, the trees pressing closer together and the sunlight filtering through in thin, dappled beams. I paused to take a sip of water, listening to the faint rustle of leaves overhead. That's when I noticed it for the first time. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, carried on the wind. I froze, straining to listen. It was probably just the wind threading through the trees, I told myself. Still, the sound unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Shaking off the feeling, I tightened the straps of my backpack and continued on. As I climbed higher, the trail grew narrower and more rugged. Large roots jutted out from the ground, threatening to trip me up if I wasn't careful. I slowed my pace, focusing on my footing. The whispering sound came again, this time a little louder. It seemed to come from somewhere behind me. I stopped and turned, scanning the trail I'd just come up. Nothing, just the quiet forest, the trees standing tall and silent like sentinels. I took a deep breath and started walking again, my senses on high alert now. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the solitude was playing tricks on me. The trail leveled out after another mile, opening into a small clearing. A single wooden bench sat at the edge, overlooking a steep drop-off that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. I sat down, grateful for the chance to rest, and pulled out a granola bar from my pack. As I ate, I scanned the horizon, taking in the rolling hills and the ribbon of a river cutting through the landscape. It was beautiful, and for a moment, I forgot about the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me. But then I noticed something. Across the clearing, on the far edge where the trees resumed their dense coverage, there was a small pile of rocks. It wasn't unusual to see cairns on hiking trails, but this one felt out of place. The rocks were arranged haphazardly, not in the neat stacks that hikers typically use to mark a path. It looked deliberate, but not in a comforting way. I tried to brush it off, but the sight of that pile of rocks stuck with me as I got up and resumed my hike. The trail continued to climb, winding its way through increasingly rugged terrain. The trees grew taller and darker, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out much of the light. It felt like I was walking through a tunnel. That's when I noticed the silence. The bird song that had accompanied me earlier was gone, as was the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional creak of a branch swaying in the breeze. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. The whispering came again, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. I was sure of that now. It sounded almost like voices, just on the edge of hearing. I stopped, turning in a slow circle, my eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sign of another person. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail was steeper now, forcing me to concentrate on each step to avoid tripping. My breathing was labored, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my back despite the cool air. The whispering followed me, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing through the trees. Then I saw it, a figure standing just off the trail ahead. My heart leapt into my throat. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely a person. They stood motionless, partially obscured by the trees. I froze, unsure of what to do. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The figure didn't move. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. My boots crunched loudly on the gravel, the sound jarring in the oppressive silence. When I reached the spot where the figure had been, there was nothing there, just the trees and the empty trail stretching ahead. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Had it been a trick of the light? A shadow cast by the swaying branches? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I turned and started back the way I'd come, my pace brisk. The unease I'd felt earlier had blossomed into full-blown panic. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of those woods as quickly as possible. The whispering was louder now, almost a chorus of voices murmuring just out of earshot. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The trail didn't look familiar. I'd been sure I was retracing my steps, but nothing about the path seemed right. The trees were different, the terrain unfamiliar. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized I might be lost. I pulled out my phone, desperate to check the GPS, but there was no signal. Of course, I'd known this area had spotty coverage, but I'd assumed the trail would be well marked enough that I wouldn't need it. Now I cursed myself for not bringing a map or a compass. The whispering grew louder, and I broke into a jog, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer and the shadows growing deeper. I tripped on a root and went sprawling, the impact jarring my knees and sending my water bottle skittering across the ground. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the bottle and shoving it back into my pack without pausing. Then I saw it again, the figure. This time it was closer, standing directly on the trail ahead of me. My heart hammered in my chest as I froze, my mind racing. It was definitely a person, but something about them seemed off. They were too still, their posture too rigid. And their face was turned away, obscured by the shadows of the trees. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No response. The figure didn't move. I took a step back, then another. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, barely managing to catch myself before I fell. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if they'd come back. I turned and ran, my lungs burning and my legs screaming in protest. The trail was a blur beneath my feet as I barreled down the path, my only thought to get as far away from that figure as possible. The whispering followed me, growing louder and more chaotic, until it seemed to fill my head. Finally, I burst into a clearing. It was the same one I'd stopped at earlier, with the bench overlooking the valley. Relief flooded through me as I realized I was close to the trailhead. I could make it back to my car and get the hell out of there. But then I saw the pile of rocks again. It was larger now, the stones stacked higher and arranged in a more deliberate pattern. My stomach churned as I realized it hadn't been like that when I'd passed it earlier. Someone had been here. Someone had added to it. I didn't stop to investigate. I sprinted past the clearing and down the trail, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispering faded as I put distance between myself and the clearing, but the sense of being watched didn't leave me. It clung to me like a second skin, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was the only one in the parking lot. The old pickup truck was gone. I didn't waste any time. I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, gravel spraying from my tires. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the middle of the road. But there was nothing, just the empty forest fading into the distance. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by the comforting noise and light of civilization. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something had happened out there, something I couldn't explain. I've thought about it countless times since that day, trying to make sense of it, but I always come up empty. All I know is that I won't be hiking alone again anytime soon, and I'll never set foot on Raven's Hollow Trail again. The cold morning air wrapped around me like a blanket as I stepped out of my car. It was just after sunrise, and the world was painted in hues of gold and orange. I had planned this solo hike for weeks, a chance to disconnect, clear my mind, and challenge myself. My destination was a lesser-known trail deep in the mountains, promising untouched wilderness and breathtaking views. It sounded perfect on paper. The trailhead was marked by a simple wooden sign, weathered and cracked from years of exposure. The parking lot was empty except for my car. I took a deep breath, adjusted my backpack, and started walking. The path was narrow, overgrown in places, and littered with fallen leaves. It was clear that not many people ventured this way. That was part of the appeal, though: the solitude, the silence, the sense of being truly alone with nature. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, the sunlight barely breaking through the canopy above. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. I stopped briefly to sip water and check my map. The trail was supposed to loop around a small lake before climbing steeply to a ridge with panoramic views of the valley below. From there, I would descend back to the trailhead. It was about a 10-mile loop, challenging but manageable. As I pressed on, the forest grew denser. The trail became harder to follow, with sections almost completely obscured by overgrowth. I had to push aside branches and step over fallen logs. At one point, I nearly lost the trail entirely but spotted a faded marker nailed to a tree. It reassured me that I was still on the right path, even if it didn't feel like it. Around midday, I reached the lake. It was beautiful, a pristine body of water surrounded by towering pines. I sat on a rock by the shore to eat my lunch. The air was still, the surface of the lake like glass. It was so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of insects and the distant call of a bird. For a moment, I felt completely at peace. This was exactly what I had come for. After eating, I refilled my water bottle from the lake using a filtration system I'd brought along. The water was ice cold and refreshing. I lingered for a while, reluctant to leave, but I knew I needed to keep moving. The climb to the ridge was the hardest part of the hike, and I didn't want to tackle it too late in the day. The trail began to climb almost immediately after leaving the lake. The incline was steep, and the ground was uneven. Loose rocks shifted under my boots, and I had to use my hands to steady myself at times. My legs burned, and my breath came in short gasps, but I pushed on. The promise of the view at the top kept me motivated. As I climbed higher, the trees began to thin. The air grew cooler, and the forest floor was replaced by rocky outcroppings and patches of hardy shrubs. I could see glimpses of the valley through the gaps in the trees. It was stunning, but I didn't stop to take pictures. I wanted to reach the top before the light started to fade. When I finally reached the ridge, the view took my breath away. The valley stretched out before me, a patchwork of greens and browns. In the distance, I could see the peaks of other mountains, their tops dusted with snow. The sky was a deep, endless blue. I stood there for a long time, letting the beauty of it all sink in. I checked my watch. It was later than I'd expected. The climb had taken longer than I'd anticipated, and I knew I needed to start heading back. The descent would be quicker, but I didn't want to risk being caught on the trail after dark. I took one last look at the view, then started down. The descent was tricky. The loose rocks made it easy to lose footing, and I had to move slowly to avoid slipping. The trail seemed even less defined on the way down, and I found myself constantly checking my map and looking for markers. At one point, I came to a fork in the path that I didn't remember from the map. I hesitated, unsure which way to go. Neither direction looked particularly well-traveled. I chose the path to the right, hoping it would reconnect with the main trail. It wasn't long before I realized I'd made a mistake. The trail became narrower and more overgrown until it disappeared entirely. I stopped, my heart sinking. I was off the trail. I took out my map and tried to figure out where I'd gone wrong, but nothing seemed to match up. The dense forest around me made it impossible to get my bearings. I decided to backtrack to the fork and try the other path, but even that proved difficult. The way back was steep and treacherous, and I kept slipping on loose rocks and mud. By the time I made it back to the fork, I was exhausted and shaken. The light was starting to fade, and the forest seemed to close in around me. Every shadow felt like it was creeping closer, every sound amplified in the silence. I took the other path, hoping against hope that it would lead me back to the main trail. Didn't. It led deeper into the forest, the trees growing so close together that they blocked out what little light was left. I stopped again, my heart pounding. I was lost. Panic started to set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had a flashlight, extra water, and some food. I could make it through the night if I had to. I tried to remember the advice I'd read about getting lost while hiking. Stay in one place, conserve your energy, and wait for help to arrive. But no one knew exactly where I was. I hadn't told anyone about this trail specifically, just that I was going hiking in the mountains. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. If I didn't find my way back, no one would know where to look. I decided to keep moving, thinking that if I followed the slope downhill, I might eventually reach a stream or a road. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks, and I had to move carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. The forest was eerily silent now, the birds and insects seemingly gone. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot and my own labored breathing. As darkness fell, I turned on my flashlight. Its beam cut through the gloom, but did little to dispel the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Every tree looked the same, every direction identical. I felt like I was walking in circles. I stopped frequently to listen, hoping to hear the sound of water or distant traffic, but there was nothing. Hours passed. My legs ached, and my throat was dry despite sipping water regularly. I was no closer to finding my way out. I considered stopping for the night and trying again in the morning, but the thought of sitting alone in the dark forest was too much to bear. I kept moving, driven by a mix of fear and desperation. Eventually, I stumbled onto a faint trail. It wasn't marked, and it didn't look like the one I'd been on earlier, but it was something. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. The trail twisted and turned, leading me through dense thickets and over small streams. I had no idea where it was taking me, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. The night seemed endless, but finally, just as dawn began to break, I saw a clearing ahead. My heart leapt. I quickened my pace, stumbling over roots and rocks in my haste. When I reached the clearing, I nearly cried with relief. It was a dirt road, overgrown but unmistakable. I followed it, my hope rekindled. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a small cabin in the distance. Smoke curled from its chimney, a sign that someone was home. I ran toward it, shouting for help. A man emerged from the cabin, his face lined with age and concern. He listened as I explained what had happened, then offered me water and a place to rest. He said the road led to a main highway a few miles away and offered to drive me there once I'd recovered. As I sat in the safety of the cabin, sipping hot tea and listening to the crackle of the fire, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I'd made it out. The experience had shaken me to my core, but it had also taught me something important. The wilderness is beautiful but unforgiving. Preparation and respect are not optional. They're essential. When I finally made it back to my car, the sun was high in the sky. I looked back at the trailhead one last time, a mix of emotions churning inside me. Then I got in and drove away, vowing to never take the wild for granted again. It was supposed to be just another weekend hike, the kind I'd done 100 times before, a break from the humdrum of my desk job, a chance to stretch my legs and breathe in some crisp mountain air. I'd been eyeing this particular trail for a while now, an offshoot of a popular route, one less traveled and rumored to have incredible views of the valley below. The map labeled it as moderately difficult, but I'd tackled harder paths. I figured I'd be back at my car before sunset. I left early that morning, the sun just beginning to light the sky. The air was cool, with a faint promise of warmth later in the day. My backpack was loaded with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a lightweight jacket, and my trusty GPS device. I checked the weather forecast, clear skies all day. Perfect. The trail started off easy enough, a gentle incline winding through a forest of towering pines. The ground was soft underfoot, a mix of dirt and fallen needles. Birds chirped overhead, their melodies blending with the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze whispered through the trees. It felt good to be out there, away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of my phone, the never-ending emails. About an hour in, I reached the fork where the main trail veered left, and the less-traveled path branched off to the right. The sign was weathered, the lettering faded, but still legible: Bear Ridge Overlook, 3.5 miles. I paused for a moment, sipping from my water bottle and studying the trail ahead. The path was narrower here, overgrown in places, but it was clear enough to follow. I adjusted my backpack, tightened my shoelaces, and stepped onto the trail. The climb grew steeper as I ascended. The forest thinned out, replaced by scrubby bushes and jagged rocks. The ground was uneven, a mix of loose gravel and exposed roots. I had to watch my footing carefully, each step deliberate. The air grew warmer, the sun now high in the sky. Sweat trickled down my back, and I paused occasionally to catch my breath and drink some water. But the views were worth it. Through gaps in the foliage, I could see the valley spread out below, a patchwork of greens and browns, with a river snaking through the middle. It was breathtaking. 2 hours in, I reached a small clearing where the trail leveled out. There was a flat rock that made for a perfect spot to rest. I shrugged off my backpack, pulled out a granola bar, and sat down. The breeze was cooler here, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds of nature around me. It was peaceful, but then I noticed something. The forest had gone quiet. The birdsong that had accompanied me earlier was gone. No rustling of leaves, no distant hum of insects, just silence. It was odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe I just stopped noticing the sounds, too focused on my hike. I finished my snack, shouldered my backpack, and continued on. The trail grew rougher the further I went. At times, it was barely a trail at all, just a faint outline in the dirt marked by the occasional cairn. I had to rely on my GPS to ensure I was still on track. The terrain was challenging, with steep sections that required scrambling over rocks. My legs ached, my shirt sticking to my skin with sweat, but I was determined to reach the overlook. I come this far. Turning back now felt like admitting defeat. About half a mile from the overlook, I noticed the first sign of trouble. A small rock slide had partially obscured the trail, leaving only a narrow, precarious path along the edge of a steep drop. I hesitated, assessing the situation. The rocks looked stable enough, and I'd crossed similar sections before. Carefully, I placed one foot in front of the other, testing each step before committing my weight. My heart pounded, the drop below a constant reminder of what could go wrong. But I made it across, my muscles trembling with relief as I stepped onto solid ground. The overlook was everything I'd hoped for. A wide, flat expanse of rock jutting out over the valley, with panoramic views in every direction. The river glittered in the sunlight, and the mountains on the horizon seemed to stretch on forever. I stood there for a long time, soaking it all in, the effort of the climb forgotten in the face of such beauty. But the sense of accomplishment was short-lived. As I turned to head back, I realized just how late it had gotten. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail. I hadn't accounted for how much slower the return trip would be, especially with the tricky sections I'd need to navigate again. I'd left my headlamp in the car, thinking I wouldn't need it. Stupid. I picked up my pace, my earlier caution replaced by urgency. The trail seemed different now, the familiar landmarks harder to recognize in the fading light. My GPS was a lifeline, guiding me back toward the main trail. But as I descended, I began to notice something unsettling. The silence from earlier had returned, heavier now, almost oppressive. Every sound I made, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the rustle of my backpack, felt amplified, echoing in the stillness. Then there were the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, slightly scuffed impressions in the dirt. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't. They were larger, deeper, the stride longer than mine. And they weren't headed downhill like I was. They were going up. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another hiker had taken this route earlier in the day. But doubt nagged at me. The trail was so remote, so rarely used. I hadn't seen a single person since leaving the main path. The footprints didn't make sense. I kept moving, my pace quickening despite the uneven terrain. My heart raced, a mix of exertion and unease. Shadows stretched longer, the light fading faster than I'd anticipated. I just reached the section with the rock slide when I heard it, a sound that froze me in my tracks. It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. The crunch of footsteps on gravel. Not mine. They were behind me, distant but distinct. I turned, scanning the trail, but saw nothing. The path was empty, the forest beyond a wall of shadow. My mind raced. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought, a deer or a bear, but the sound had been too deliberate, too human. I forced myself to keep going, my movements clumsy now, my legs heavy with fatigue. The rock slide loomed ahead, the narrow path even more precarious in the dim light. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and started across. Halfway through, I heard it again, closer this time, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, and then something worse, the faint clatter of a rock dislodged behind me. Panic surged, my hands trembling as I clung to the rocky ledge. I didn't dare look back. Somehow, I made it across, my legs threatening to give out as I collapsed onto the trail. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline overriding exhaustion, and started running. The trail blurred around me, my focus narrowing to the path ahead. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. Finally, I saw it, the fork where the trail rejoined the main path. Relief flooded through me, the thought of the wider, more populated trail a lifeline. I stumbled onto it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But I didn't stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until I reached the parking lot, my car a welcome sight in the gathering darkness, that I allowed myself to stop. My hands fumbled with the keys, my head snapping up at every sound. When I finally slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, I felt a rush of relief so intense it left me shaking. I never figured out who or what was on that trail with me. Maybe it was another hiker, someone just as startled by my presence as I was by theirs. Or maybe it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in the solitude. But something about those footprints, those deliberate sounds, still haunts me. I haven't been back to that trail since. It started as an ordinary hike. I'd planned the route weeks in advance, checking the weather, studying the terrain, and making sure I had everything I'd need. It was a solo trip, something I'd done countless times before. There's a certain peace in walking alone through the wilderness. No deadlines, no noise, just the rhythm of your own steps and the hum of nature around you. The trail I picked was remote but not obscure. A long loop through the dense forest with a high ridge offering panoramic views. I'd estimated it would take me about 6 hours. I started early, parking my car at the trailhead just as the sun broke over the horizon. The light was soft and golden, spilling through the trees as I tightened the straps on my pack and set off. The first hour was uneventful. Birds sang in the canopy above, and the air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The trail was well marked, winding upward through switchbacks that gained elevation steadily. I felt strong, energized by the crisp air and the promise of solitude. By mid-morning, I'd reached the ridge. The forest opened up, revealing a breathtaking view of rolling hills stretching out into the distance. I paused to catch my breath and take it all in, snapping a few photos before continuing on. The trail here was narrower, less traveled, but still discernible. I noticed the subtle shift in the landscape as the trees thinned, replaced by rocky outcroppings and scrubby vegetation. The wind picked up, whistling faintly through the sparse trees, and I pulled on a light jacket. About 3 hours in, I reached the midpoint of the loop. This was the most isolated section of the trail, farthest from the trailhead and any nearby roads. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, though I chalked it up to my imagination. I paused for a quick snack, sitting on a flat rock and savoring the silence. There was no sound of other hikers, no distant hum of cars, just the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of an unseen bird. It was the kind of quiet that's both comforting and unnerving, a reminder of how far removed you are from the rest of the world. As I packed up and started walking again, I noticed something odd. The trail seemed less distinct, the dirt path blending into the surrounding undergrowth. I'd studied the map thoroughly and knew I hadn't taken a wrong turn, but it felt off. I slowed my pace, scanning for trail markers. The next one was farther apart than I expected, a faint slash of paint on a tree trunk barely visible through the foliage. It was unsettling, but not alarming. I'd encountered poorly maintained trails before. The deeper I went, the more overgrown the path became. Branches reached out to snag at my clothes, and the ground was uneven, dotted with roots and loose rocks. I had to keep my eyes on my feet to avoid tripping, which meant I wasn't paying as much attention to my surroundings. It wasn't until I stumbled over a hidden root and caught myself on a tree that I realized how quiet it had become. The birdsong had faded, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. The wind had died down, and the air felt still and stagnant. I shook off the unease and pressed on, telling myself I was being ridiculous. This was just another hike, no different from the others I'd done. The trail would open up again soon, and I'd laugh at how my imagination had run away with me. But the further I went, the harder it was to convince myself. The forest seemed wrong somehow. The trees were taller, their trunks gnarled and twisted in unnatural shapes. The undergrowth was dense, almost suffocating, and the path all but disappeared beneath it. After another hour of pushing through the brush, I began to worry. I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while, and the terrain didn't match what I'd studied on the map. I stopped to check my GPS, but the signal was weak, and the screen showed nothing but a blank grid. I tried retracing my steps, but the way back looked no more familiar than the way forward. Panic started to creep in, a tightness in my chest that I fought to suppress. I was experienced, I reminded myself. I'd been hiking for years and had gotten turned around before. This was no different. I just needed to stay calm and think. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find a clearer section of trail or a recognizable landmark. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer together as if they were trying to swallow me whole. My steps felt heavier, my breath louder in the suffocating silence. Every sound I made seemed amplified, from the crunch of leaves underfoot to the rustle of my pack. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I saw no sign of anyone or anything else. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to change. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The forest grew darker, the canopy above so thick it blocked out most of the light. I stumbled frequently, my legs growing tired and my nerves frayed. I was no longer walking with purpose, but lurching forward blindly, desperate to find a way out. Then I saw it, a structure in the distance, partially hidden by the trees. Relief flooded through me. It was probably an old cabin or ranger station, a place where I could rest and get my bearings. I quickened my pace, ignoring the protests of my tired legs, and approached the building. As I got closer, my relief turned to unease. The structure was small and dilapidated, more of a shack than a cabin. The wood was weathered and rotting, and the windows were either shattered or boarded up. There was no sign of recent activity, no path leading to or from it. Still, it was shelter and I needed to regroup. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The air was stale and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay. The interior was empty save for a few broken pieces of furniture and a layer of dirt and debris covering the floor. I set my pack down and pulled out my map, trying once again to orient myself. The dim light made it difficult to see, and I had to hold the map close to my face. As I studied it, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, a soft rustling that could have been the wind. But there was no wind. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. My heart pounded as I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped just outside the shack. I held my breath, the map slipping from my trembling fingers. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked, as if someone was testing it from the outside. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. Grabbing my pack, I bolted through the back door, stumbling into the forest. Adrenaline propelled me forward, my fear overriding my exhaustion. I didn't look back, didn't stop until my legs gave out and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. The forest around me was dark now, the last traces of daylight fading. I knew I couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable. I had to keep moving. For hours, I wandered aimlessly, my flashlight casting feeble beams of light that barely penetrated the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but I forced myself to focus on survival. I needed to find water, shelter, and a way out. Finally, just as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I stumbled onto a dirt road. Relief washed over me as I dropped to my knees, tears streaming down my face. The road was rough and overgrown, but it was a sign of civilization, a lifeline. I followed it, my steps unsteady but determined. Hours later, as dawn broke, I emerged onto a paved road. A passing car slowed. The driver's concerned face the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. They offered me water and a ride to the nearest town, where I finally felt safe again. The experience left me shaken but grateful. I'd come face to face with the raw, indifferent power of nature and survived. And though I'd continue to hike, I'd carry the lessons of that day with me. To respect the wilderness, to trust my instincts, and to never underestimate the value of preparation. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being out in nature that clears my mind. The dense trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the sound of a stream somewhere off the trail. It all feels so alive. So when I had a free weekend, I decided to tackle one of the more challenging trails in the region. It was a 12-mile loop deep in the mountains, known for its steep ascents and stunning views. I had read that it wasn't heavily trafficked, which suited me perfectly. I wanted solitude. I arrived early that Saturday morning. The parking lot at the trailhead was empty except for my car and a rusted pickup truck. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the air had a bite to it. I zipped up my jacket, shouldered my backpack, and checked my gear one last time. Water, snacks, map, first aid kit, and my knife. My phone had some signal, but I wasn't counting on it once I got deeper into the trail. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail wound through a forest of towering pines, their needles carpeting the ground. The incline was gentle and I found a good rhythm. Birds chirped above, and occasionally I'd hear the rustle of small animals darting through the underbrush. I felt at peace. After about an hour, the trail started to climb more steeply. The trees thinned out, and I began to get glimpses of the valley below. The sun was fully up now, and its warmth felt good on my face. I stopped to drink some water and take in the view. The horizon stretched out in shades of green and blue, the mountains layered like folds in a quilt. I hadn't seen a single person since I started. Perfect. As I continued, the trail became rougher. Loose rocks and roots jutted out, demanding my full attention. Around mile 5, I reached a narrow section that hugged the side of a steep hill. To my left, the ground dropped away sharply into a ravine filled with dense brush. To my right, the hill rose steeply, its surface dotted with jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. I slowed down, careful with each step. That's when I saw it. Ahead on the trail, maybe 30 yards away, was a shoe, just one, lying on its side. It was a hiking boot, scuffed and worn, with the laces tangled. I stopped, puzzled. It's not unusual to see discarded items on trails. A lost water bottle, a dropped glove, but a single shoe? That was odd. I looked around, scanning the trail and the surrounding area, but saw nothing else out of place. Shrugging it off, I continued. Another mile in, I came across more oddities. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. A crushed energy bar wrapper ground into the dirt. Pair of broken sunglasses. It was like someone had passed through here in a hurry, shedding items as they went. I felt a prickle of unease, but told myself it was probably just a careless hiker. Maybe they'd had an accident and needed to lighten their load to get back to the trailhead. By the time I reached the halfway point, the trail had leveled out onto a rocky plateau. The view was breathtaking. Jagged peaks in the distance, a river snaking through the valley below. I sat down on a flat rock to eat a granola bar and check my map. According to it, the trail looped back toward the trailhead from here, descending gradually. I'd be back at my car by late afternoon. I was packing up when I noticed something strange. In the dirt near where I was sitting, there were footprints. They weren't mine. These were larger and deeper, like someone had been running. The prints led away from the trail, toward the edge of the plateau. I followed them with my eyes and saw where they stopped abruptly at the edge. Beyond that was a sheer drop of at least 200 feet. My stomach tightened. I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe someone had come to the edge to look over and then walked back the same way, erasing part of the trail. But the prints looked fresh, and there were no signs of a return path. I backed away from the edge, an uncomfortable feeling settling in my chest. The descent was harder than I expected. The trail was steep and covered in loose gravel, making it easy to slip. I took my time, planting each step carefully. The trees closed in again, their branches forming a canopy that dimmed the light. The air felt cooler, damp even, and the sounds of birds had faded. It was eerily quiet. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes to my left. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, like something large moving through the undergrowth. A deer, I thought, or maybe a bear. I gripped the handle of my knife and slowly backed away from the noise. Whatever it was didn't follow, and after a few tense moments, I continued down the trail, my senses on high alert. The further I went, the more the trail seemed off. Sections of it looked disturbed, as if someone had been dragging something heavy through the dirt. Twice, I found deep gouges in the ground, parallel lines that ran across the trail and into the woods. I had no explanation for them. My unease grew with each step. Around mile 9, I came across another item, a backpack. It was sitting just off the trail, leaning against a tree. It looked weathered but intact. I approached cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded small in the vastness of the forest. No answer. I crouched down and inspected the bag. It was empty, the zippers open, and the contents long gone. The straps were frayed, as if they'd been chewed on. By now, my nerves were frayed too. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my heart racing. I quickened my pace, eager to put distance between myself and whatever was out here. The last few miles were a blur. I hardly remember the trail, only the pounding of my heart and the persistent feeling of eyes on my back. When I finally saw the parking lot through the trees, relief washed over me. I half-jogged the last stretch, my legs burning with the effort. But when I reached the lot, I stopped cold. My car was there, just as I'd left it, but the rusted pickup truck was gone. In its place was another object, a single hiking boot, identical to the one I'd seen earlier on the trail. It was propped up against the driver's side door, the laces neatly tied. I didn't wait to think. I threw my backpack into the car, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to turn over. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest stood silent, the trailhead disappearing behind me. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know whose footprints those were, or who left the backpack, or why the boot was by my car. But I do know one thing: I won't be hiking alone again.